It has been an extraordinary few weeks in Linux, not in a vague, things are happening way, in a specific, documented multiple significant events at once way that does not come around very often. This month was pretty smooth. We had no build delivery drama, and all OS images we shipped were of satisfactory quality. The project is maturing, and we're 78% of the way towards completing the beta milestone. That is KDE Linux's June 2026 monthly report, published on July 1st, yesterday. KDE Linux is the KDE community's own operating system, and that sentence contains a phrase worth noting. No build delivery drama. Because May 2026 had drama. Specifically, a kernel security audit that revealed problems nobody was expecting, a decision to completely restructure how KDE Linux builds its software, and a security cleanup that removed a significant number of packages from the distribution. Alongside the KDE Linux story, Linux Kernel 7.1 released on June 14th. KDE Neon released a major update on June 18th with dedicated images for desktops, mobile devices, and big screens. Arch Linux released its July 2026 ISO with Kernel 7.0. 10, KDE Gear 26.04. 2 dropped over 100 updated applications. And the NTFS drama that has been simmering in the kernel community finally produced a concrete outcome worth explaining. Let us go through all of it. Most people in the Linux community have heard of KDE, the desktop environment, the organization that makes Plasma, the highly customizable desktop that ships on countless Linux distributions, including CatchyOS, Fedora, KDE, and others. What fewer people know is that KDE has been building its own operating system, not just a desktop environment that other distributions use, an entire operating system, kernel, package management, update infrastructure, security model, installation images, all developed by the KDE community directly. KDE Linux is KDE's in-progress operating system. The end result was a slew of cuts that included dropping the Zen kernel, axing several insecure kernel modules, removing a bunch of unused packages, and finally killing off the project's AUR dependency. This is the May 2026 cleanup story, and it deserves unpacking because it reveals how seriously the KDE Linux team is taking security. The Zen kernel was a custom-configured Linux kernel that KDE Linux had been using because it offered performance improvements over the vanilla Arch Linux kernel. In May 2026, after multiple security issues were discovered in the upstream Linux kernel, KDE Linux developers did a mini audit of their distribution. The audit revealed that the Zen kernel's additional patches and modules were introducing complexity without sufficient security benefit. It turned out the Zen kernel no longer offered very much beyond the config tweaks we had already made anyway, so they dropped it. Back to vanilla kernel. The kernel module cleanup was more substantive, deleting the insecure and unused alpha-LG kernel modules, replacing the NTFS and CDEMU kernel modules with their user space fuse versions, removing the out-of-tree OpenRaiser and APFS kernel modules. It was nice to have these pre-installed, but we realized they would eventually cause us to fail secure boot review, and we should instead be working towards upstream solutions. The secure boot concern is the most practically significant driver here. Out-of-tree kernel modules, modules that are not part of the official Linux kernel source and are maintained separately, cannot be signed with the keys required for secure boot validation. A distribution trying to build a fully secure boot compliant system has to either get its modules into the upstream kernel or remove them. KDE Linux is choosing to remove them and work on upstream solutions. This is the right long-term decision, even though it means removing convenient features now. Nate also added a service that installs newly added pre-installed Flatpak apps on existing KDE Linux systems automatically, while leaving untouched anything the user has already removed on purpose. This is a thoughtful UX detail. When a distribution adds a new default application, say a new PDF viewer or a new media player, existing users should get it automatically if they have not made a specific choice to remove that category of software. The logic is, respect deliberate user choices, but do not leave existing installs behind when defaults improve. This service handles exactly that balance. KWallet Manager is being retired in favor of Keep Secret, a new, more modern KDE app for managing passwords and credentials. KWallet has been the KDE password manager for many years. Keep Secret is its replacement, built with modern KDE frameworks, a cleaner interface, and better integration with the current Plasma desktop. The transition represents the KDE community making deliberate decisions about technical debt, retiring old components that work but are increasingly difficult to maintain and replace them with fresh implementations built for current architecture. We're 78% of the way towards completing the beta milestone, 78% toward beta. That is meaningful because it suggests KDE Linux is not a far future project. It is approaching the point where it will be stable enough to recommend to users who are not already experienced Linux administrators. The KDE community's track record with Plasma 6, one of the most substantial Linux desktop upgrades in years, suggests they can execute when they commit to something. Linux 7.1 has been released on Sunday, 14th of June, 2026. A major kernel release in the middle of June is significant context for everything happening in distributions this month. Every distribution that runs a current kernel, rolling release distributions like Arch and OpenSUSE Tumbleweed, and distributions using 8WE kernels like Ubuntu 24, Eero 4, and Zorin OS 18. 1 will be integrating 7. 1 features and fixes over the coming weeks. The Arch Linux July 2026 ISO, released July 1st, ships with kernel 7. 0. 10, the latest stable in the 7. 0 series. As the 7.1 stable track matures, expect 7.1 to appear in Arch packages shortly. The timing of Linux 7.1 landing alongside significant security cleanup work in KDE Linux is not coincidental. The multiple security issues discovered in the upstream kernel last month, referenced in KDE Linux's May report, are the kind of vulnerabilities that new kernel releases address through backported patches and architectural improvements. Distributions doing security audits and updating kernel configurations in May and June 2026 are responding to the same upstream kernel security landscape. The NTFS situation in Linux in 2026 is messier than most coverage has acknowledged, and the KDE Linux decision about NTFS modules is a good lens for understanding why. There are multiple NTFS implementations in and around the Linux kernel. The original NTFS 3G is a Fuse-based user space driver that is stable and reliable, but slightly slower because it does not run in kernel space. The in-kernel NTFS 3 driver, introduced in Linux 5.15, runs in kernel space and is faster, but has a documented history of reliability problems, including data corruption on certain workloads. In Linux 7.1, there is a further revision to the in-kernel NTFS implementation. This leaves only the still corrupting NTFS 3 without G driver, even in recent kernels. Heads up, large file write crashes, NTFS 3 on kernel 7. 0. 4. KDE Linux's decision to move from the in-kernel NTFS 3 driver to the user space Fuse-based NTFS 3G approach is a pragmatic safety call. Kernel space NTFS is faster. It is also still causing data corruption in some workloads as recently as kernel 7. 0. The slower but reliable Fuse approach is the right choice for a distribution that is trying to build a trustworthy default experience. This is the kernel drama referenced in the title of this video. Not a fight between kernel developers, not a Linus Torvalds outburst. The drama of having multiple competing NTFS implementations with different reliability profiles, and distributions having to make hard choices about which one to trust with user data. KDE Linux made the conservative choice. That is probably right for users who have NTFS partitions and care more about not losing data than maximizing I/O performance on Windows formatted drives. For most Linux desktop users, NTFS is an edge case anyway. You encounter it when you plug in a USB drive formatted on Windows, or when you're accessing a shared partition in a dual boot setup. The in-kernel performance advantage only matters if you're doing heavy I/O on NTFS volumes, which is not common in the use cases KDE Linux is targeting. KDE Neon 2026-60618 expands its download menu with dedicated images for desktops, mobile devices, and big screen setups across 3 distinct release tracks. The project pairs a stable Ubuntu LTS foundation with rolling upstream Plasma updates, keeping the desktop fresh without demanding a full system rebuild every week. KDE Neon occupies a specific and useful position in the Linux ecosystem. It is not a general-purpose distribution like Ubuntu or Linux Mint. It is the reference implementation of the latest KDE Plasma desktop, the place where you get the absolute most current version of Plasma running on a stable, long-term supported Ubuntu foundation. The expansion to include dedicated images for mobile devices and big screen setups in the June 18th release is significant because it demonstrates that KDE Plasma's multi-form factor ambitions are advancing toward distributable form. KDE's Plasma Mobile project has been developing for years. Having a KDE Neon image specifically for mobile devices means there is now an official KDE-maintained way to install the latest Plasma Mobile on supported hardware without custom-built steps. The big screen image targets TV and couch gaming setups, a form factor that Plasma's big screen interface has been developing alongside the mainstream desktop. For users who want a living room Linux setup, the dedicated big screen image simplifies installation significantly. Keeping it current requires running specific upgrade commands or using Discover, since standard package managers often choke on rapid dependency changes. Hardware support stays strictly limited to open source drivers. So anyone relying on proprietary NVIDIA stacks or needing bulletproof daily reliability should probably stick to a different distribution. This caveat is important for potential KDE Neon users to understand. The fast-moving Plasma updates that make Neon valuable are also what make it slightly more demanding to maintain. And the open-source drivers only constraint means NVIDIA proprietary driver users should look at Ubuntu or Fedora KDE instead of Neon, where NVIDIA support is better integrated. The KDE Gear 26. 04. 2. Update delivers over 100 patched applications designed to eliminate launch hangs and timeline rendering glitches across desktop Linux systems. Developers prioritized backend stability by aligning framework dependencies and fixing critical crashes in tools like Kdenlive, NeoChat, and Dolphin. KDE Gear is the package of applications that KDE ships alongside Plasma. The file manager Dolphin, the video editor Kdenlive, the terminal app console, the messaging client NeoChat, the file archiver Arc, and roughly 100 more. Gear 26. 04. 2 is the second maintenance update to the April 2026 Gear release, and its focus on launch, hangs, and timeline rendering glitches is specifically targeting the kinds of annoyances that accumulate to make a desktop feel unpolished. Launch hangs, where an application takes noticeably longer to appear than expected, or appears visually before it is interactive, are one of the most common user complaints about Linux desktop performance. Kdenlive timeline. Rendering glitches affect video editors who use it as their primary creative tool. Dolphin crashes affect essentially everyone who uses KDE, since Dolphin is the file manager the entire desktop depends on. These fixes are not glamorous, they will not generate YouTube thumbnails, but they are the kind of systematic maintenance work that makes the difference between a desktop environment that feels polished and one that feels like a work in progress. Let me pull these 5 stories into a coherent picture, because individually they are news items, and together they tell you something about where Linux is in July 2026. KDE Linux reaching 78% of its beta milestone while making the security conservative decisions described above tells you that this project is being built carefully rather than rushed. The KDE community is not trying to ship an alpha quality product and iterate on it with real users. They are doing the boring, necessary security audit work and the build infrastructure work before they declare it beta. That is the right approach. Linux kernel 7. 1, releasing on June 14th, continues the kernel development pace that has produced a new major version every few months. The security improvements in 7.0 and 7.1 are feeding directly into distribution's security posture reviews, exactly what you saw with KDE Linux's May audit. The NTFS situation is an honest reminder that Linux's handling of proprietary file systems remains a work in progress. The data corruption issues in the in-kernel NTFS3 driver are not new. They have been documented across kernel 5, X and 6, X and 7.0. The community is working on improvements, but has not fully solved the problem. For users with NTFS drives who need reliable write access, the user space fuse approach remains the recommendation until the upstream situation improves. KDE Neon's expansion to multi-form factor images demonstrates that Plasma's desktop to mobile to big screen ambitions are materializing into distributable form. This is not the same as saying KDE Linux phones are ready for mainstream use. They are not. But the infrastructure for a unified Plasma experience across form factors is advancing. The consistent message across all of these stories: the Linux ecosystem is doing the work, not the exciting announcement work, the unglamorous maintenance work, the security audit work, the build infrastructure work, the file system reliability work, the work that produces a platform you can trust, rather than a platform that only runs correctly when everything goes exactly right. Several specific things to track in August 2026. KDE Linux's next monthly update will show whether the automatic QA system that Bhushan Shah and Thomas Duckworth have been developing is integrated. Once it is, KDE Linux will be able to automatically detect broken builds before release, a significant quality improvement that changes the project's reliability trajectory. The NTFS3 kernel driver situation should be updated in Linux 7. 1. The community note about NTFS3 receiving an overhaul, including write support, in 7. 1 suggests the data corruption issues may be addressed in the newest kernel. Watch the Fornix kernel coverage for independent testing of 7. 1's NTFS write reliability. KDE Plasma 6. 4 is due in August 2026. The KDE release schedule targets 2 major Plasma releases per year, and the August release will likely be the most feature-complete version of Plasma 6 yet. Given that Plasma 6 has already been a significant step forward from Plasma 5, the August release is worth watching for gaming and creative workflow improvements specifically. The big picture remains: Linux in July 2026 is a maturing, security-conscious, multi-form factor platform with an active development community doing the maintenance work that turns promising software into reliable infrastructure. The KDE Linux project, in particular, represents something the Linux ecosystem has not had before: the desktop environment creators building their own complete operating system, not a distribution that happens to use KDE. KDE building the OS itself, making every layer decision from kernel configuration to Flatpak packaging to security policy. Whether that produces something significantly better than the existing KDE distributions remains to be seen. But the approach, community control from kernel to desktop, is exactly what the Linux ecosystem's most principled advocates have always argued for.